72,000 tons of steel. That is the number to hold in your mind. 72,000 tons. The largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen, larger than anything any navy had put to sea, larger than anything that would be built for another decade, heavier than most battleships, heavier than the Titanic. And on a cold night in November of 1944, all of that steel would be sitting at the bottom of the Pacific, dragged down by 4 torpedoes fired from a submarine less than 1/50th its size. She carried more than 2,000 men. Before sunrise on the 29th of November 1944, 1,435 men aboard the ship were dead. This is the account of how the largest aircraft carrier in the world at that time was sunk by a single submarine just 10 days after being commissioned into service. This is how it happened. To understand the scale of what was lost, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a time when Japan believed it could still win. It is 1940. The Imperial Japanese Navy is building the most powerful warships in human history. Yamato, Musashi, steel leviathans displacing over 70,000 tons, mounting 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell the size of a small car across 25 miles of open ocean. These were not merely ships. They were statements. They were the physical proof of an empire that believed it was destined to rule the Pacific, and there was meant to be a third. Hull number 110. Her keel was laid down in May of 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in the deep secrecy that surrounded everything about these ships. She was to be the third sister, another floating fortress, another god of war. However, following the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Navy decided to convert the incomplete battleship hull into an aircraft carrier. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. In a single morning, the rules of naval warfare changed forever. The battleship, the weapon Japan had staked its future on, was suddenly obsolete. It was the aircraft carrier, the flat-topped ship that launched planes over the horizon, that now ruled the seas. And 6 months later, at a scattering of islands called Midway, that lesson was carved into Japanese history in fire and salt water. In a single day, Japan lost 4 of its frontline carriers. 4, the heart of its striking power, gone in an afternoon. So in June of 1942, the Japanese Navy made a decision that would set everything in motion. Hull 110 would not be finished as a battleship. She would be transformed, rebuilt into an aircraft carrier. But her construction was already too far along to make her a fast fleet carrier like the ones lost at Midway. So instead they made her something else. A giant, the largest, the most heavily armored, the most survivable carrier ever conceived by human minds, built to arm and support other carriers far out at sea. They would call her Shinano, and here is where she became something the world had never seen. Most aircraft carriers are built to be fast and fragile, long, thin-skinned ships designed to launch planes and stay far from danger. They are built to run, not to fight. But Shinano had been born a battleship, and she kept a battleship's armor. Steel along her waterline. An armored flight deck thick enough to shrug off bombs that would gut any other carrier, when most carriers made do with wood. Hundreds of watertight compartments, sealed sections, designed to trap flooding and keep her alive. Her designers believed they had built something close to unsinkable. A ship that could take punishment no carrier had ever been asked to survive and keep steaming. Let that sink in. At Midway, the American carrier Yorktown took 2 torpedoes and, in time, went to the bottom. The British carrier Ark Royal took a single torpedo and sank. Most carriers of that war were fortunate to survive 3 hits. Her own half-sister, Musashi, would take some 19 torpedoes and countless bombs before she finally went down. This was the bloodline Shinano came from. The ships that would not die. They believed they had built something that could not be sunk. But building the largest warship in the world takes time, and time was the one thing Japan no longer had. By 1944, the empire was dying. American submarines were strangling the sea lanes, sinking the tankers and freighters that kept Japan breathing. American bombers were beginning to reach the home islands. The great chain of Pacific islands, conquered in the first triumphant year of the war, was collapsing one by one. And the American forces were drawing close enough that Yokosuka itself, where Shinano lay unfinished in her dock, was now within reach of the B-29 super fortress. So the Navy made a desperate gamble. Get her out. Commission her now, incomplete as she was, and move her to safer waters where she could be finished in peace. On the 19th of November, 1944, Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. But she was not ready, not close. Many of her watertight doors were not yet installed, and the compartments that were sealed had never been tested to see if they truly held. Her damage control systems were not fully working. Her crew had not finished training together. She was, at best, barely seaworthy enough for one short voyage. And that would have to be enough. The plan was simple. Sail from Yokosuka to the naval base at Kuri, some 300 miles down the coast, where she could be completed in safety. Hug the shoreline. Travel at night when submarines struggle to see. Bring destroyers to guard her. One short trip. What could go wrong? Now, some 200 miles away, there was another ship and another man whose fate was about to collide with all of this. His name was Joseph Enright. He was 34 years old, a commander in the United States Navy, born in the small town of Minot, North Dakota. And he was a man carrying a private wound that would not heal, because a year earlier, Enright had been given a moment that most submarine commanders only dream of. In the autumn of 1943, in command of the submarine USS Dace, he had received an intelligence message, an intercept of the highest secrecy, telling him exactly where to find a Japanese aircraft carrier called Shokaku. Position, course, speed, everything he needed. A carrier waiting to be hunted, and he found her. But when the moment came, Enright hesitated. He made what the record calls a timid approach, and as the darkness bled toward dawn, he broke it off. He let the carrier go. She steamed away untouched, and his patrol ended with nothing to show for it. There are failures a man can explain away, and there are failures that follow him. This was the second kind. Enright knew what he had let slip through his fingers, and he could not bear it. When Dace returned to base at Midway, he did something few officers ever do. He asked to be relieved of his own command. He wrote that he was responsible for an unproductive patrol and requested to be replaced by an officer who could do better. The Navy granted his request, and Joseph Enright was sent ashore to a desk, while other men took submarines to sea and came home with flags and medals and reputations. For half a year, he sat at the Midway submarine base, living with the memory of the carrier he had allowed to escape. That could have been the end of his story. A quiet, forgotten career. A man remembered only for the shot he never took. But the Navy gave him something rare, a second chance. In September of 1944, they handed him a new boat, USS Archerfish, a Naval-Class fleet submarine, 311 feet of steel, fast and reliable, armed with torpedo tubes fore and aft. She had already made 4 war patrols under other commanders and had almost nothing to show for it either. An unremarkable boat and a commander with a stain on his record. 2 things the world had written off. On the 30th of October, 1944, Archerfish slipped out of Pearl Harbor and turned her bow toward Japan. For the next weeks, she did quiet, thankless work, waiting off the coast to rescue American airmen shot down during the bombing raids. But by the 28th of November, no raids were scheduled. Enright was free. Free to hunt along the approaches to Tokyo Bay, in the dark water where the giants passed. Neither man knew the other existed. Enright did not know that the greatest target in the history of submarine warfare was, at that very moment, preparing to leave port and steam straight toward him, and aboard Shinano, no one imagined that a single battered American submarine, commanded by a man haunted by the carrier he once let go, was waiting in the night directly across their path. 2 ships, 2 men, one already the largest warship afloat, the other still trying to prove he deserved to command anything at all. And the sea was about to bring them together. 6 o'clock in the evening, the 28th of November, 1944. The light was failing over Tokyo Bay. Shinano cast off her lines and moved out into the darkening water. Aboard her were more than 2,000 men, sailors, officers, and over 100 civilian workers from the Yokosuka yard who were still, at that very hour, laboring to finish the equipment that should have been done weeks before. In her holds, she carried fuel and ammunition, spare parts, and 50 Oka rocket bombs, small piloted flying weapons built for one purpose, to be flown by a man into the side of an enemy ship. She was meant to carry them south, toward the killing grounds of the Philippines and Okinawa. She was not yet a warship in the truest sense. She was a fortress still being built, sent to sea before her time. On her bridge stood Captain Toshio Abe. He was an experienced officer, a man who had survived years of war at sea, marked for promotion to admiral once his great ship was finished. But he had never commanded anything like this. Nothing this large, nothing this heavy, nothing this important. Around the great carrier moved her three guardians, the destroyers Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze. Veteran ships scarred by earlier battles, their crews sharp and watchful. Their orders were simple: keep the giant alive, get her down the coast and into safe harbor. Shinano pushed out into the open Pacific, weaving from side to side in the zigzag pattern that every commander used to throw off a submarine's aim. And on his bridge, Captain Toshio Abe, an experienced officer, commanded Shinano on her first voyage. He was unaware that only one American submarine was in contact with his force. His ship was the most heavily armored carrier ever built. He was hugging a coast where American submarines rarely dared to come. He had destroyers hunting the water ahead of him. And he had the darkness itself, the friend of every ship that fears the torpedo. He carried in his mind a fact that steadied him. His ship's own half-sister, Musashi, had taken 19 torpedoes before she died. What was one submarine to a ship like this? What Captain Abe did not know, could not know, was that ahead of him in the darkness, a submarine had just risen to the surface, and she was sitting almost directly in his path. It was 8:45 that night when Archerfish came up out of the deep to breathe. She had no choice. A submarine of that war ran on batteries beneath the waves, and those batteries had to be charged by diesel engines, and diesel engines needed air. So she surfaced into the night, exposed and vulnerable, her hull black against a black sea. It was a clear night, calm water, good visibility. And for a submarine on the surface, good visibility cuts both ways. You can see them coming, they can see you. Then a voice cut through the quiet of the boat. Radar contact, range 12 miles. And it was big. Multiple ships, moving fast, sweeping down the coast. Commander Enright was on the bridge in seconds, binoculars up, scanning the dark horizon. And there, at the edge of the world, he found them. Escort ships. And in the center of them, something else. A shape, a mass, a silhouette too large to make sense of. His first thought was almost mundane. A tanker. Perhaps an oil tanker, riding low and heavy, slipping out of the bay under cover of night. It was the reasonable guess, the safe guess. But something about the size of it gnawed at him. For the next hour he watched, and the shape refused to shrink into anything familiar. By 11 that night, the truth had settled over him like cold water. That was no tanker. That was an aircraft carrier. And it was enormous. Guarded by destroyers running hard for home. Here is the first cruelty the night had. Prepared for Joseph Enright. He gave the order, all ahead full, and his diesel engines roared to their limit, driving Archerfish across the surface in pursuit. And it was not enough. The target was faster than Archerfish could manage on the surface, faster than she could ever manage below it. Think about what that meant. The greatest prize a submarine commander could ever dream of was passing before his eyes, and his boat was simply too slow to catch it. And this was the man who, 1 year before, had let a carrier slip through his hands in the dark, the same nightmare, returning to find him. Around 23:22 that night, a bearing on one of Shinano's propeller shafts began to overheat. To avoid further damage, her speed was reduced to 18 knots. Around 11 that night, something failed deep inside the giant. A bearing on one of her propeller shafts began to overheat, and to spare it, Shinano was forced to slow, down to 18 knots. And in that single mechanical moment, her margin of safety, the 2 knots of speed that should have carried her clear of all danger, was gone. Now the submarine could keep pace. Now the race was even. But even keeping pace was not enough to attack. Enright knew these waters. He knew where the great ships went when they ran for safety. And he made a decision that was equal parts calculation and desperation. He would not simply chase the carrier from behind. He would guess where she was going, race for a point ahead of her, and get there first. Lie in wait in her path and let her come to him. It was a gamble that could ruin him. If he guessed wrong about her course, he would lose her entirely, chasing empty ocean while she vanished toward home. He would have failed with a carrier a second time. And a man does not survive that twice. For hours Archerfish ran through the night, her engines straining, throwing herself across the sea toward the spot where Enright prayed the giant would appear. His plotting team worked the target's course through the darkness, again and again, until they could name the base course beneath all the zigzagging. And then, for a time, he lost her. Only the running remained, and the guessing, and the terrible silence of not knowing whether he was racing toward history or toward humiliation. And then, out of the dark, the radar spoke again. Contact. His gamble had paid. The Japanese force was almost exactly where he had reckoned it would be, and now Archerfish was drawing into position, the hunter finally getting ahead of the prey. But now, across the water, a different mind was working against him. And here is where the story turns on the smallest of human errors. Late in the night, a lookout on Shinano caught a glimpse of the submarine on the surface, moonlight sliding off her wet hull. And Captain Abe made an assumption. He believed he was not being stalked by one boat, but by a wolf pack, a coordinated group of American submarines closing on him from several directions. It was a reasonable fear. It was also completely wrong. There was no pack. There was only Archerfish, one boat, one man. And that single mistaken belief shaped everything Abe did next. It was not panic. Abe was a calculating man. When one of his own destroyers broke formation to hunt the contact, he ordered it back into line. Certain the lone submarine was only a decoy, bait meant to pull his escorts away so the rest of the pack could strike at his carrier. So he held his screen tight around him and maneuvered to slip past enemies who were not there. Now hold this image in your mind, because it is the heart of the whole tragedy. Every turn Abe made to avoid the trap he imagined was carrying his ship closer to the one submarine that was real. Had he simply held a straight course and run for home, even at 18 knots, he might have kept the American behind him. But he wove, and he held his destroyers close, and in doing so, he steered the giant toward Archerfish's torpedo tubes. Just before 3 a.m, Shinano turned to the southwest, and for a moment she was heading almost straight at the waiting submarine. Enright turned east and slipped beneath the surface. The boat went silent, the way a held breath is silent. Non-essential machinery shut off. Men moved without sound. Then, at the worst possible moment for Japan, a destroyer came on. One of the escorts passed directly over Archerfish in the dark. Below, the crew held still and waited for the ping of sonar that would mean they had been found. Waited for the depth charges. The sonar man listened. No pinging. The destroyer had passed right over them and never known they were there. It slid away into the night to carry a signal to the carrier, passing so close that Enright could have reached out and touched its wake. And Enright raised the periscope and, for the first time, looked clearly upon the thing he had been chasing through the night. What he saw did not fit the world he knew. A carrier so vast it made every ship in his memory look like a child's toy. A flight deck stretching some 800 feet, the length of city blocks. An island rising from her hull like a cliff. This was no carrier he had ever studied. This was something new, something the intelligence reports had never whispered a word about. He did not know her name. He did not know she was Shinano, the Empire's most guarded secret, a ship so classified that many of Japan's own officers did not know she existed. He only knew she was the largest thing he had ever seen on the water, and that he had one chance to put her on the bottom. He sighted her through the periscope at 7,000 yards. For a heart-stopping moment, the angle looked wrong. The carrier bearing down so close that she would pass too near for a clean shot. And then, at 16 minutes past 3, Shinano zigged one last time, some 30 degrees, and settled onto a steady course. At approximately 0256 on the 29th of November, Shinano turned to a southwesterly course. This change, of course, presented Archerfish with a favorable firing position along the carrier's starboard side. The carrier swung her entire flank open to him, the full length of that enormous hull laid bare, and the range fell to 1,400 yards. A straight target, a clean firing solution. The kind of shot every submarine commander waits an entire career to be given, and most never are. At 03:06 on the morning of the 29th November 1944, Enright ordered the firing of 6 torpedoes from the forward tubes. 4 of the 6 torpedoes struck the carrier along her starboard side, 3:16 in the morning, the 29th of November, 1944. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left the tube. Then another, and another. 6 times Archerfish lurched as her weapons ran out into the black water from her bow tubes, one after the next, spread along the length of that enormous hull to rip her open all down her starboard side. 6 torpedoes, each carrying hundreds of pounds of explosive, each running hot and straight toward the largest ship that had ever floated. And Enright had done one thing more, one deliberate choice born of judgment. He had set the torpedoes to run shallow, near the surface, at a depth of just 10 feet. Partly to be certain they would strike, even if they ran deeper than intended, as these torpedoes often did. But partly for a colder reason. He hoped that by tearing into the carrier high on her flank, he might roll her over. He might make the giant capsize. Now came the worst part of any attack, the waiting. 1,400 yards. In the silence of the submerged boat, men counted the seconds in their heads and did not speak. The carrier could turn. The weapons could fail. The destroyers could see the wakes and come hunting. Then, carried through the water and up through the steel of the hull, came the sound every submariner knew in his bones. A deep, heavy concussion, the first hit. Enright, still at the periscope, saw a ball of fire climb into the night sky near the carrier's stern. 8 seconds later, a second explosion ripped along her hull, farther forward. He saw enough to know she was already beginning to lean toward him, listing to starboard. Before he took his boat down in the cramped dark of the submarine, the men allowed themselves the smallest measure of joy. Not cheers, not shouting. Sound travels underwater, and the destroyers were near. Just a quiet, fierce relief. 4 of the 6 torpedoes had found her. 4 hits on a target that size. It should have been a death sentence. But Enright could not stay to watch. The escorts were already turning, already hunting. He took Archerfish down, deep 400 feet toward the crushing pressure, where the boat's own hull groaned under the weight of the sea, and rigged for silent running. Above him, the destroyers came, and the depth charges began to fall. 14 of them, thundering through the water. The nearest some 300 yards off, each one a hammer blow searching for the submarine's hull. And then, between the explosions, the crew heard something else. Long, terrible groaning noises. The sound of steel tearing of a great structure coming apart. For 47 minutes, those breaking up sounds carried to them in the depths, and every man aboard understood what he was hearing. Something enormous was dying up there. Now let us go up to the surface, to the dying ship. Aboard Shinano, most of the crew had been asleep or standing quiet watch. The ship had steamed for hours without trouble. And then 4 torpedoes tore into her side, and the sea came pouring in. And here, in this moment, everything Shinano had been designed for should have saved her. This was the ship built to take punishment. No carrier had ever survived. This was the fortress with hundreds of sealed compartments meant to trap the sea and hold it back. Captain Abe took the reports. 4 hits, fluting, a list beginning to pull his ship to starboard. But the giant was still under power, still moving, and Abe was not overly alarmed. He remembered Musashi, the sister ship that had absorbed 19 torpedoes before she sank. His own ship had taken 4. He judged the damage serious but survivable, and he believed he could still reach Kure. He held his course at 18 knots. He did not yet understand the truth of his own ship, because Shinano had been sent to sea unfinished, and she betrayed her crew in ways no one could see. The torpedoes had struck along a hidden weakness, the seam where her armored belt met the bulge that was meant to stop torpedoes, a flaw she had inherited from her battleship sisters. Every one of the 4 hits landed along that same fatal joint. The force of the blasts tore an iron beam loose inside one boiler room and drove it clean through the wall into the next, opening a wound where there should have been none, and her watertight doors were not all installed, and those that were had never been tested. Where equipment was still being fitted, there were gaps, passages that were supposed to be sealed and were not. The great compartmentalized fortress, the design that was meant to make her nearly unsinkable, had never been finished. Her executive officer would later say that within minutes of the last torpedo, he heard air hissing through the seams of the watertight doors, the sound of the sea forcing its way in through doors that had never truly been sealed. Many members of the crew had been aboard for less than 2 weeks. A number of watertight doors had not yet been installed, and those that were in place had not been tested. As a result, flooding spread more rapidly than anticipated through compartments that should have remained isolated. The list to starboard deepened. The pumps could not keep pace with the flood. Water reached compartments that had never been touched by a torpedo. Abe reduced speed further, tried to shift the balance of the ship, threw every hand into the fight. He even hoped, as the hours wore on, that his destroyers might tow the great carrier into shallow water and run her aground before she could sink. It was a desperate idea, and it came too late. A ship of 70,000 tons does not answer to a tow line once the sea is inside her. Around 6 in the morning, Shinano lost power. The engines that had driven her went still. Now she was only a darkening shape in the dawn, leaning further with every hour, drifting. The giant leaned further over. 10 degrees, 15, 18. The flight deck tilted like a hillside. Equipment broke loose and slid across the steel. Men clung to railings to keep their feet. At last, Captain Abe faced the truth. He had tried to hold off all night. His ship could not be saved. He gave the order to abandon her. But even this was cursed by her unfinished state. The severe list made the boats and rafts on the high side nearly impossible to launch. Men leapt into the cold Pacific, some with life jackets, some without. The destroyers moved in to gather them, but carefully, because a ship that size, when she rolled, could pull others down with her. At 18 minutes past 10 in the morning, 7 hours after the torpedoes struck, Shinano heeled over and rolled onto her side. For a time, she lay there in the water like a wounded animal, unwilling to die. And then, near 11 o'clock, she began her final plunge, her stern rising, her great propellers turning slowly in the open air, until, with a sound like distant thunder, the largest aircraft carrier ever built slid beneath the surface and was gone. Of the more than 2,000 men aboard her, 1,435 did not come home. Some drowned, trapped inside her. Some were lost when she rolled. Some died in the water, too spent to reach the ships that came for them. Captain Abe chose not to leave her. He had given the order to abandon ship. And then, in the old tradition of his navy, he stayed behind. A survivor in the water looked back and saw a heavy figure still clinging to the bow rail, and believed it was his captain. Abe went down with the ship he had commanded for just 10 days, one of the 1,435. She had lasted 10 days from the moment of her commissioning. 10 days. When Archerfish returned to base, Enright reported sinking a large Japanese aircraft carrier. At the time, American naval intelligence had no record of such a vessel, and initially credited the submarine with sinking a smaller carrier of approximately 28,000 tons. Only after the war, when Japanese records became available, was it confirmed that Archerfish had sunk Shinano, a vessel of approximately 72,000 tons full load displacement. Shinano remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. She had been in commission for only 10 days.